Hello and welcome. That's Maltese if you weren't aware. At least I hope so. This is City Breaks Valletta, Episode 6, Food and Festivities. Yisimni, Marion Jones. I am Marion Jones. Yes, food and festivities, plenty of both, as you're about to hear. Although, in fact, one of the first things I read on the topic didn't sound too promising. Here's one Patrick Brydon writing in the 1770s about how it's not all that easy to grow produce on Malta. Quote, "The industry of the Maltese in cultivating their little island is incontrovertible. There is not an inch of ground lost in any part of it, and where there was not soil enough, they have brought over boat and ships loaded with it from Sicily, where there is plenty to spare." But worry not, because here comes something I read just recently in a British newspaper, the Telegraph. Quote, "The Maltese love their food, so eating where the locals eat is a good starting point. And try not to be in a hurry. Food in Malta is to be sat over and enjoyed." On the subject of food, as so often with other topics in Malta, a key idea is the great variety of influences from other lands which you find almost whenever you sit down to eat. So those would include, for example, the Knights, yes, them again. Because don't forget, they came originally from various different European countries, and of course they brought influences with them. Aliotta, for example, a fish broth with a sort of garlicky, herby taste, is said to have been based originally on the French bouillabaisse. An influence from Sicily would be timpana, a pasta pie, made by tossing macaroni and tomato sauce and minced beef all together, add some raw egg and grated cheese, put the whole lot in a pastry case and bake it. Arab influences too. Stuffed peppers and aubergines are very popular, for example, and also seen in the sweets. Something called, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, helva tat tork, sugared almonds to us. Picture Malta in the middle of the Mediterranean, just as close to Africa as parts of Europe, and yes, a North African influence too. For example, kuksu, giant couscous made with broad beans and goat's cheese. There's even a British influence. For example, I came across a recipe for Maltese trifle, and I noticed in the grocery shops a curious array of what you might call quite old-fashioned British ingredients. Think English mustard, Bovril, Worcester sauce, English chocolate bars, Mars and whatnot, although curiously, no Maltesers, at least not as far as I could see. These all date back to the time when the British were garrisoned in Malta and wanted to be able to buy some of these very familiar products from back home. The flavours of Malta then. I think you'd have to start with the bread, of which they're very proud. Traditionally, a fatira, round loaf, chewy. I saw it described somewhere as super crunchy on the outside, fluffy on the inside. And rabbit. That did seem to be a key ingredient all over the place. I came across the idea more than once that the national dish was rabbit stew, or stufat talfenek in Maltese. Maltese sausage, that's definitely a thing, made with pork mince, flavoured with parsley, garlic, coriander. Eaten grilled, added to soup, used in stuffings. Fish, of course, on an island, as you'd expect. You almost certainly noticed those very brightly coloured fishing boats. Perhaps you saw some fishermen mending their nets along the quay. Perchance you called into a quayside restaurant and enjoyed some fish. The name I kept coming across was lampuki, dolphin fish, but also squid and, as mentioned before, the fish soup. What about street food? Two things particularly I'd mention. Pastizi. When I first saw a pasticceria, I thought maybe it sells a mix of pasta and pizza, but no, it sells pastizi, which are little savoury snacks, pastry cases filled with ricotta or mushy peas, and available certainly all over Valletta. And secondly, the sandwiches, made with traditional fatira bread, following these instructions which I came across. Split the fatira, spread it with tomato paste, drench it with olive oil, and then add anything you fancy. And examples given were tuna, anchovies, sheep or goat's cheese, Maltese sausage, begia, which is a broad bean paste, lettuce, olives, basil, salt, pepper. In other words, a proper feast of local products sandwiched between two slices of lovely Maltese bread. Sweet foods are quite a thing too, not least because honey is very much associated with Malta. So much so that both the Greeks and the Romans are said to have named the island melita, which was the word for honey. It starts with the wildflowers and the 1,000 or so different species found on the island, which of course attract bees. Many different types of bee, in fact, including one subspecies that is apparently not found anywhere else, so an actual Maltese bee. Anyway, sweets, pastries, cakes, all very popular, particularly one called imkaret, which is a sweet pastry filled with dates and cinnamon and other spices, perhaps cloves, aniseed, and lots of different ways to use ricotta. In cannoli, Sicilian or Italian influence there, I think, so pastry tubes filled with sweet ricotta filling. Then there's sinitsa, a pastry case with a sponge cake inside. I think you'll spot as I go along that they do seem to be very fond of pastry. Anyway, this one is a sponge cake filled with apricot jam and sweet ricotta. And then there's zeppoli too, an almond and ricotta cake. So, moving on to meals, a couple which I had more than once and really enjoyed. Stuffed aubergines, so that's an aubergine baked in the oven and then filled with a mix of mince, onions, cheese, tomato paste, a raw egg, and baked again. Very nice indeed. And for something I always knew I was going to like, but which would be a little bit of a surprise, a Maltese platter. So slightly different anywhere I had it, but basically a large plate with lots of goodies on it. Bread and water biscuits probably, Maltese sausage and goat's cheese, and lots of little bits and pieces to pick at. Olives, sun-dried tomatoes, a little dish of bagila perhaps, which is a broad bean puree. So you boil the beans, mash them up with plenty of salt and pepper and lemon juice and olive oil. A good way to discover various different Maltese foods all at once. I made a list of some of the dishes I saw on boards outside restaurants. Wild boar stew, pulled rabbit rigatoni, swordfish and aubergine ravioli, locally sourced snails, slowly stewed in wine with onions, carrots, celery, tomatoes and potatoes, linguine octopus. So linguine served with a tomato sauce rich in octopus, capers, olives and sun-dried tomatoes. And I kept seeing lampuki, the dolphin fish. You could have them fried with tomato sauce. You can have them oven-baked with your cheese and breadcrumb topping. You can have lampuki with pickled onions, or baked lampuki, or lampuki with caper sauce. And I kept coming across what you might call celebration food, so special things baked for particular times of the year. For example, something traditionally made for Christmas but found all year round. We found a box actually in the flat that we rented as a little welcome gift. Unfortunately, it's not easy to pronounce in Maltese, but I'll have a go. Quagak tal casel, perhaps, which means honey rings. Little ring-shaped cakes, a little bit like donuts, with a stuffing of honey and aniseed and cinnamon. Then there's a celebration cake, prignolata, about which I read, quote, "The hundreds of prignolata filling the confectionaries all over the Maltese islands are a sure sign that Carnival is approaching." It's another pastry case filled with biscuits, candied fruit, cream, nuts and chocolate. Cover the whole lot with Italian meringue and you will have, said the description I read, something resembling a snow-capped mountain, which struck me as slightly odd because there are no mountains on Malta. Anyway, the pictures were lavish, showing these snowy mountains decorated with chocolate drizzles and cherries and nuts. There's a special cake for Lent too, named after the 40-day fast kept by Christians during Lent, based I think on the Latin for 40 days, another unpronounceable word in Maltese, possibly quaresimal. Anyway, a cake made without fat and without eggs, at least in the old days. These days, apparently you might add some egg white. So made of a mix of ground almonds, sugar, egg white, and flavoured with honey and orange rind and cloves. Straight after Lent, Easter, when you might eat the figola, the Easter cake, sweet chalk crust pastry, almond filling, often made in the shape of a fish. And at the other end of the year, a very strange item sold in the shops in November, I think to mark All Saints and All Souls, a cake whose name in Maltese, and I'm really not going to even try this one, means bones of the dead. It is actually bone-shaped. I thought they looked like dog bones, actually, and they are made of 2 pastry layers with marzipan in between, topped with icing. You'll be picking up, I think, that festivals and feast days are very important in Malta. Oh yes. I read, for example, that they have 14 public holidays a year, which is twice as many as we have in Britain. one of the highest numbers across the European Union, apparently. And there are many, many more celebration days sprinkled between them. Religious, historical, cultural festivals, all sorts. And I'm going to start with something particularly Maltese, the Festi, of which there are apparently about 95 a year. And that's just on the main island. Gozo has about 10 of its own. So they are special days held in individual towns and villages to mark the feast day of the patron saint of that place. They began during the time of the Knights, and they've been a thing ever since. Most of them are in the summer, let's say between May and September. Some villages have 2 parishes, so then they'll have 2 patron saints and, yes, 2 different festa, and each one a whole day of celebration. Think religious processions, marching bands, fireworks, lots of good food, traditional sweets, of course, particularly. In Valletta, there are no fewer than 5. The 24th of January, St. Paul's Shipwreck. 22nd of May, St. Rita. 4th of August, St. Dominic. 7th of September, Our Lady of Consolation. 15th of September, St. Augustine. Often they are linked to the name of the local church. So in Floriana, for example, on April the 14th, it's St. Publius Day. And in one of the 3 cities, the one with 2 names, Birgu and Vittoriosa, the 10th of August is St. Lawrence Day. Although each one centres around a day, I discovered that they do go on longer than that. Something called the Big March is likely to take place a couple of days before the main day. There'll be a period when particular religious relics are out on display in the church, and then on the day itself, celebrations from morning till night. A march in the morning when the saint will be paraded out from the church around the village and then back again in the early evening, met en route by crowds, applauding, throwing confetti, balloons, streamers, fireworks. The village square will have been specially decorated, and the church steeple too, sometimes with decorations that people have been preparing all year round. There'll be a grand fireworks display in the evening, and lots of fuss and noise and hoo-ha. Think stalls selling sweets and other delicacies, toys for the children, glow sticks, water guns, etc. Loudspeakers, lots of music. On the whole, just plenty of noisy fun and exuberance, although occasionally it can go a little bit too far. I found on a website called Malta Uncovered a description of the 2 rival festas which take place in the little village of Zurich. So there's the Festival of the Madonna in July and the Santa Caterina Festival in September. And here's what I read. Quote, "The Zurich youths passionately dedicate oaths to their patron saint, and occasionally they do hurl a few insults against their rival faction. Yet this hardly ever turns violent or obscene." Well, that's good, isn't it? You might like to do some planning and see what's on while you're on the island, or you might like to do what we did, which is just happen across various things. 3, in fact, in the week that we were there in April. So one evening, I'm not quite sure why, there was a parade from George Square round to St. John's Cathedral in Valletta, led by a group of people carrying a huge high platform with the Virgin Mary sitting on top and walking along singing and saying prayers. Prayers, incidentally, which I noticed that a lot of the people watching knew and joined in with. Then when we were over in Birgu, or Vittoriosa as it's also called, we went to have a look round St. Lawrence Church to find that something was happening. There were crowds of people all around the outside waiting expectantly. And luckily, a very kind local man came up to us and said, "Do you have any idea what's about to happen?" "No," we said, "please tell us." And he explained that every year on this day, outside St. Lawrence, they have a reenactment of the World War II bombing, which was a terrible disaster, especially in this little area of the town. 35 people had taken shelter in the crypt of the church, hoping they would be safe, but when the direct hit was taken, they were all killed. Locals were dressed up, they played the parts of all the people who had been killed, dashing about, chatting to each other, a normal day really, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, the bomb which killed them all. All 35 names are listed on a big plaque just outside the church. And then on another evening, which we had decided to spend in the flat, we suddenly heard the unmistakable noise of lots and lots of fireworks. Turned out it was the April International Fireworks Festival. A reminder that you really should research this sort of thing in advance. Turns out it happens every year. It's when the big firework producers all hold displays to sort of try and outdo each other, really, I think. And the whole thing ends with a grand finale at the Grand Harbour. What is it with Malta and fireworks, I wondered, and research tells me that this long, long tradition dates right back to the Knights of St. John, who used to use them to celebrate special occasions. Quite apart from all the village and town festivals are the annual events based around the church year, Malta being a very Catholic country, 93% Catholic I think I read somewhere. Easter, of course, is the highlight of the church year. Before that comes Lent, and just before that comes Carnival. So parades and processions with floats, something I saw described somewhere as the colourful, the grotesque and the loud. So yes, think fancy costumes, marching bands, street theatre, masked balls. Sweet treats like sugar-coated almonds and prignolata, that carnival cake I was describing. I think generally pretty raucous, although I did discover that 'twas ever thus. In 1560, the Grand Master Jean de Valletta himself had to reprimand the knights after Carnival for, quote, too much revelry. They had decorated all the ships in the harbour, they'd had plenty of music and dancing, they'd been inviting strangers in masks on board. So then, after Carnival and Lent, Easter, which on Malta is celebrated for well over a week. It starts on the Friday before Good Friday, known as Our Lady of Sorrows, when there will be religious processions, the faithful walk along singing hymns and praying. A large statue of Our Lady of Sorrows is carried up on high. Some people walk barefoot, some drag heavy chains tied to their feet. A solemn day of sorrow and repentance. 2 days later, Palm Sunday, so processions with palm leaves. Maundy Thursday then, in Holy Week, so the Thursday after Palm Sunday, the day when the Last Supper was held. There'll be exhibitions about the Last Supper in a number of the churches. Special services are held at which the priest washes the feet of 12 people from the congregation who represent the 12 apostles. And traditionally, after this Mass, a lot of Maltese families get together and do something called the Seba Visti, which means 7 visits. So they visit 7 different churches and say special prayers in each one. And then they eat a ring-shaped loaf of unleavened bread, so remembering the Last Supper, a special bread named after the apostles, called in Maltese something like Quakhak Tal Apostoli. Good Friday then, the next day, solemn processions, people carrying statues to represent different parts of the Passion of Christ. Big, heavy statues, so 6 or 8 people needed to carry each one. At dusk there'll be reenactments, so where people in white robes and hoods and carrying wooden crosses process between the stations of the cross, retelling the story. And then the explosion of joy on Easter Sunday, when the special Mass is celebrated, bells are rung, and after Mass, lively band marches and another procession carrying the statue of the risen Christ. There are other religious festivals too throughout the year. For example, March the 19th, the Feast of St. Joseph. He's the patron saint of workers and fathers, so they are especially celebrated in church services, parades, fireworks. June the 29th is the Feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, so the 2 patron saints of Malta. August the 15th, the Feast of the Assumption of Our Lady. That's one of the biggest feasts of the year. So again, decorations, activities, processions, food, and, you've guessed it, fireworks. More street theatre to celebrate Christmas, especially in some of the villages where there'll be an immersive reenactment of the Bethlehem story. So the villagers become actors and play all the characters, and the story is portrayed for everyone to enjoy. Christmas Eve will include midnight high mass, and then a large meal starting at 2 a.m, and Christmas Day, largely food all day I think from what I've read. And if you're beginning to think, yes, there are a lot of high days and holidays, there's another section which I haven't even mentioned yet, and those are the days which commemorate something which happened in history or national days, that sort of thing. March the 31st, a public holiday because it's Freedom Day, marking the end of the British military presence in Malta in 1979, which was billed at the time apparently as the first time in 1,000 years that there were no occupying forces on the island of Malta. Special events at the War Memorial in Floriana and a military presence, so a march past by the armed forces of Malta, wreath laying and whatnot, and a regatta and boat races in the Grand Harbour. The 7th of June, 7 Giugno, I think it's called in Maltese, another public holiday to celebrate a terrible event which happened on the 7th of June 1919, which was seen in retrospect as a real turning point in Maltese history, the point at which the nation took a real step towards wanting independence and working towards it. So it was a time of poverty. There were rising prices for basic foods like bread and flour, and eventually there was rioting. The troops were called, that's British troops of course. They fired on the protesters and 4 people were killed. So a sombre day with ceremonies and wreath laying. So remembering that event, but also in honour of the courage of everyone who fought over the centuries for Malta's freedoms. And September the 8th, a very interesting one, with a whole set of coincidences which pile up. It's known as Victory Day, or sometimes Our Lady of Victories, a public holiday, definitely. September the 8th is the Feast of the Nativity of Mary, and it is also the date over 3 different centuries on which something really important happened in Malta. So September the 8th, 1565, the day the siege against the Ottomans was finally won. They were driven away. In other words, Malta wasn't captured, it remained a Christian island. September the 8th, 1800, the day on which Napoleon and his troops were driven away. You might remember from an earlier episode Napoleon had said he didn't see why they shouldn't take Malta. French troops did indeed arrive and settle in. They were only there for 2 or 3 years and they were driven out. So that was September the 8th, 1800. And then, amazingly, the same day again, in 1943, saw the end of the siege of the Axis powers, so Italian and German troops driven away from Malta. You might remember a quote from an earlier episode in which somebody said that was the moment when Malta could breathe again. But we're not finished yet. In fact, we're not even finished with September, because September the 21st, another public holiday, is Independence Day in Malta, which has been celebrated every year since 1964, when Malta attained its independence from Britain. And in December the 13th, in fact, Republic Day, which has been celebrated ever since 1974, because that was the year when Malta left the Commonwealth and became a republic. So from that date, the King or Queen of England was no longer the head of state in Malta. That role was to be played from then on by the President. Yes, more festivities, including, I'm told, horse racing. So we've done the village festivals, the religious ones, the historic days, the national days, but there's more. Festivals that you might file really under the general heading of, well, why not? Music festivals, for instance. The last week of June is Malta Music Week, when big acts will play in all the open-air venues, and the whole thing ends in a huge free concert in Floriana. Also in June, something called the Gala Fest, which is a 3-day folk festival, celebrating Maltese folk particularly, but with lots of international guests, and a whole sort of side events, think traditional Maltese cuisine, craft exhibitions, that sort of thing. Malta Jazz Festival, that's a 3-day event in July, featuring top musicians, and culminating in a last open-air event at the Grand Harbour. Malta's International Air Show is in September, so lots of aircraft on display, civil aircraft, military ones, pilots manning stands that you can go and talk to. A special feature is usually aircraft from World War II. There are displays as well, so maybe of parachuting. Perhaps the Red Arrows will visit. The legendary Spitfire may even do a fly-past. Something else again in October, the White Night as it's known, Notte Bianca. Also known apparently as Lit Up Night, because I think there are lots of candles and torches. A free event in Valletta, a celebration of arts and culture really, and it lasts all night, so starting at 6 p.m. and going right round to 6 a.m. the next day. Loads of different performances and concerts, both outdoors, so in the streets and the piazzas, but also as a one-off in lots of unlikely indoor spaces in churches, in some of the palaces and auberges in the museums. They're all open all night long, and the shops and restaurants are open much longer too. So yet another excuse for a festival atmosphere. And I might finish by just mentioning one festival that isn't in Valletta, it's in Birgu, or Vittoriosa. Why do the 3 cities have 2 names? It's most confusing. Anyway, on the first weekend of October, there you will find 3 days of events, guided tours around the city, lots of reenactments and parades, concerts, exhibitions, food stalls, All the museums are open late. Some places which are usually closed open up just for that one weekend. And the highlight, which does sound really rather lovely, is the Saturday night called Birgu by Candlelight, when 10,000 candles of all different kinds and sizes light up the beautiful old city. That's one I missed but would definitely go back for. Even now I haven't covered anything like all of this, but I hope I have given you some pointers of things to look out for, and I really would suggest that if you're going to Malta, you make a better job than I did of researching in advance the special events that are on during the time that you are there. We managed to miss the International Fireworks Festival, which, let's face it, on Malta is going to be quite a thing, by simply not knowing in advance that it was on and being too far away when we realised to get down there in time. What a wasted opportunity. Don't do that. So then, I hope I'm leaving you with the idea that both food and festivals are very much to be enjoyed, really all over Malta, and in Valletta particularly. The food, of course, you can enjoy whenever you go. The festivals will almost certainly provide little bursts of noise and colour and fun and exuberance to punctuate your visit. There's been particularly lots of detail, I think, in this episode, so if you want to capture it and think about it in a bit more of a leisurely fashion, do have a look at the blog post where it will all be summarised. So that's www.citybreakspodcast.co.uk. Info, links, pictures, lots of other cities, and a new inspiration section so you can check by destination if you know where you want to go, what's on offer. But if you'd rather start with what is there for foodies, or where can I go if, say, art is my main focus. If you click on the Inspirations button at the top of the page, a drop-down menu will appear with those two headings and several others. So maybe a different way to think about where you'd like to go next. And if you're like me, you're probably always sort of thinking about where you'd quite like to go next. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you very much for listening, and let me end by saying thank you and goodbye in what I believe to be the Maltese phrases for those two messages. Grazie hufna. Saha.